A lot of the days have like events that are named fairly innocuous things like Intro to Calisthenics, which sounds fairly simple. Like it should just be like, okay, here's how you do like, a good push up, break 90 degrees, or a good pull up, hit the bar to the clavicle. But the instructors find ways to make it fairly torturous. People always say like, I went through on like the last hard class. I think I went through like on one of the last easy classes. So now it's probably much more difficult. So if you're attempting it, I think you're probably going to experience like not quite the dial being turned up like gradually, maybe the dial being, jacked up right really high at the start. We were partnered with a Afghan militia unit called the VRU, which stood for Village Response Unit. That was led by a guy named Azizullah Karwan, who was kind of like at least in this part of Afghanistan, kind of a very notorious figure. He was an ethnic Tajik, so like to other Tajiks, he was kind of like a national hero. To a lot of Pashtun, he was a opponent, kind of a tyrant. February 8th, 2018, there were a JSOC element. There was a JSOC element with about 30 people in total. That was a mix of like Delta Force guys, Rangers, I believe, and then also combat controllers from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, the Tier 1 combat control unit.
My program curve at 354. That's on. Picture 16, 15,000. Driver one targeted.
Kyle, thanks for joining me on the podcast, man. To this point that I haven't had a JTAC or a combat controller on here is a foul on my part, but it'll be great to talk about that. And then also your journalism career. So we got a lot to cover today.
Yeah, definitely, man. Thank you very much for having me on, and I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I want to kick it off with where'd you grow up? And then how did you decide to go into the Air Force? What made you want to go in the Air Force?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I had a lot of different inputs that kind of influenced the decision. But I came from a military family. That's probably the biggest influence there. My dad was in the Air Force. He was actually a fighter pilot. And so, when I graduated high school, joining the military was one of those things that was just on the plate. I originally had kind of considered going to college and doing that whole route. And I kind of felt like I just wasn't really prepared to take the jump into that. And I wanted to first get a little bit more life experience and also find a way to pay for college. So went down to the military recruiters, kind of went to all of them, and ended up settling back on the Air Force because, my dad was in the Air Force and that was kind of home, and they had a lot of good career field options, and the special operations career fields that they offer specifically were just really interesting to me. And it's not a good reason to pick like combat control or pararescue over other special operations jobs, but one of the things that really sucked me into it was the fact that CCT and PJ as well is like guaranteed to go through Halo and dive school. And I thought that combination was like really cool. Whereas when I was looking at the Green Beret 18X contracts that allow you to go in off the street, they don't actually guarantee those kinds of schools. In fact, you kind of just get static line jump training off the bat. And then once you get to team, it depends on like if you go to like a Halo team or a dive team. And so one of the things that just sucked me in was like this cool option of going to dive school, getting guaranteed open and closed circuit training, and then like also going to Halo school and guaranteed free fall jumping. And superficial reason to pick that job, but that's what sucked me in initially. And actually, when I started going through the training and getting a little bit more of a grasp on what the job entailed, I enjoyed other aspects of it too. But that was kind of what like sucked me in and grabbed me and pulled me in that direction.
It's not the most superficial reason I've heard, but did your recruiter, did you know that much about the career field, knowing, hey, I can go to Halo school, or was your recruiter telling you, yep, if you go CCT, you're guaranteed to go to Halo school?
The recruiter had like brochures that like listed all of the like the whole pipeline, the training program you go to, and like what you're guaranteed to go through as long as you pass selection and pass all the other schools along the way. And I knew a little bit about CCT because I had read one of Sean Naylor's books on the battle at Takur Ghar, the John Chapman whole fiasco back in like that came out in like 2006 or something like that. And so I had read that in high school. I think it's called like No Good Day to Die or something like that. Someone can fact check that if they want. But it's a really good book. Just kind of goes over Operation Anaconda, which Sean Naylor was a journalist who was embedded during the battle. And there's a lot of good information in there, and that kind of like piqued my interest. And then from there, there was not a ton of information online because this was at a point where I don't think that the career fields were as well known as they are now. And even now they're kind of still like,
Right.
kind of the ugly stepchildren and maybe the Air Force, but there was still some information online, and I was mostly able to cobble together the exact like structure of the pipeline and like what to expect from the internet rather than from my recruiter. And the recruiter was helpful, but he wasn't a special operations career field member. He was like a typical Air Force recruiter and really nice guy, but he's come into it a little bit blind. But yeah, mainly the internet was my friend there.
Yeah, I was going to say, because that's pretty specific in the fact that, again, if I was a recruiter, all right, I probably could stumble across the maintenance career field, but like I have no idea what guaranteed schools you're going to get to go to, et cetera. So you obviously put some effort in doing the research to know, hey, that's a guarantee versus, go to Green Beret. You're not necessarily going to get that chance. What did your dad fly, out of curiosity?
He flew a lot of aircraft. So I don't know what he started with. Around the time I sort of became sentient as a child, he was flying the F-117 stealth fighter. And then I think maybe prior to that, he did the F-16. And then after the stealth fighter, he went to an Air National Guard unit up in Connecticut, and he was flying the A-10 Warthog.
Okay.
And after that, he ended his career actually flying the Predator drone out at Davis Monthan. And so that's where I ended up graduating high school. In the middle of high school, we moved from Connecticut down to Arizona in the Davis Monthan area. And he was flying drones out of there. And that was also actually kind of influential in my recruiting because there is a contingent of PJs there. There's like a rescue squadron. And so when I was in high school, one of the graduation requirements was to go and find a career field in the community that you like look up to or like have like aspirations to join. And I ended up getting in touch with a PJ down there at the base and kind of shadowed him for a few days. And from there, he gave me a lot more perspective on like the CCT PJ. He had gone through back in like the 90s when it was like a totally different type of pipeline, but the CCT and PJ communities had always been kind of blended and had gone through similar trainings. And so he was able to kind of give me a lot of perspective on just joining the Air Force generally, but also what it would be like getting into like the special tactics career fields.
Did your dad push you like, hey, it looks like you got an interest in going into the special ops community? And it's like, hey, this is a good thing to go do? Or is it just like you were hell bent on enlisting and going down special forces road?
I was definitely pretty hell bent on it. This is also kind of, I think like a childish read on things, but at the time I like viewed the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as primarily like special operations wars. And so I felt like if I was going to go, I wanted to do something like that. That's obviously not how those wars actually played out, but that was the view of like a 17-year-old at the time. And yeah, I was pretty hell bent on it. And, I also just viewed it as like, kind of a good challenge to pursue early in life. I mean, I had a pretty middle class background, so I kind of wanted to like have some sort of like trials and tribulations in my life, I guess. And that kind of oriented me in that direction. And my dad, I wouldn't say he was against it or anything. He had gone to the Air Force Academy, so I think he had kind of hoped that I would go. If I did join the military, I would go that route. But ultimately, he co-signed it. I mean, literally co-signed it. I was 17, so he had to like sign the enlistment contract. So, he blessed it in his way. But yeah, I think if he like had his full choosing of like my life career, I think he would have, if anything, pushed me to like more of a civilian life. He never really pushed the military on us as kids. Funny enough, though, I joined the military. My brother joined the military. My brother became a sensor operator on a drone in the National Guard, and then my sister went active duty as well. And she she joined the Air Force as well, and she became an airborne linguist. She
Okay.
speaks Pashtun actually. So all of his kids ended up joining the military, and so that kind of sounds like he probably somewhere along the way was like planting ideas in our minds. But truthfully, I didn't feel like I had that pressure on me. But it just kind of works out that way when most I think people in the military or in the U.S. military usually come from families that have some sort of military connection. Kind of makes it easier to envision joining.
Yeah, you gotta have some kind of drive. Obviously, being exposed to it, and knowing, oh, that's something I could do, makes it a little bit easier. I'd probably parallel that story a little bit. But I want to jump into. I know very little, obviously, about the pipeline and how the pipeline split. But like a special tactics squadron, there's all sorts of different Air Force specialties. So can you kind of talk to me about the process of like once you went through basic training and then you're off to the combat control pipeline? What did that look like, and then how does it come out at the end?
Yeah, so obviously, like the CCT, like I'll just bunch it all together and call it like the Special Tactics career fields. Those are very different than like your initial entrance into the Air Force. Basic training, for anyone who has gone through like the enlisted side of the Air Force, knows it's a lot of like folding clothes and a lot of like marching around and kind of like very like anachronistic kind of military bearing type atmosphere. But it that's obviously has its role, gets you like discipline, starts thinking as a team and all that. But it's mostly, I would say, like Air Force basic training, fairly sedentary, and then you kind of have like a little bit of a shock to the system when from there at Lackland, San Antonio, you go across the base to this place. When I was going through, it was called the Medina Annex. Now it's called the Chapman Training Annex in honor of, I think, John Chapman, who was a Medal of Honor recipient for the combat control community. But anyway, you go over to the Medina Training Annex and you kind of check in, and it's pretty smooth to begin with. And you get into like a typical like barrack atmosphere and, bunk up with like 3 people a room. Then you start selection. And selection, I think at different times in the pipeline, it's had different names. I think the latest name, it's called like like an orientation course. I'm not sure, but suffice to say, the like initial like intro training program usually lasts about like 4 weeks or so, and it's not the most difficult thing that you'll go through in the pipeline, but I would say it's kind of an initial shock to the system. You get a lot of introduction to like, a lot of the days have like events that are named fairly innocuous things like Intro to Calisthenics, which sounds fairly simple. Like it should just be like, okay, here's how you do like, a good push up, break 90 degrees, or a good pull up, hit the bar to the clavicle. But the instructors find ways to make it fairly torturous. Same thing with like introduction to like water confidence type events. You get into the pool and you experience like water confidence events for the first time, like underwaters or buddy breathing with a snorkel. All these different types of things you start gradually getting introduced to. And selection itself, again, it's not like the hardest part or it wasn't the hardest part when I went through. But as you go through the pipeline, those like training gauges keep getting added and keep getting turned up and dialed up a bit. And so it did get pretty hard, but like, it's kind of like a slow burn. At least that was the way the CCT pipeline was designed when I went through. And I went through at a period where it had been actually broken off from the PJ pipeline, because initially PJ and CCT were combined together. They went through the same indoc. And then after the indoctrination, which is what they called their selection phase at that time, after the indoctrination, they kind of went off to their different schools, but there was more of like kind of like a shared starting point. And my understanding now is the pipeline's kind of gone back to that. And so if I were to kind of speculate, which I want to do sometimes, I would say that probably before I joined, that indoc, that combined, was probably like the hardest type or the hardest years of the pipeline. The people who went through that have probably dealt with like the biggest like attrition rates. And then now I'd say it's kind of returned to that. So people always say like, I went through on like the last hard class. I think I went through like on one of the last easy classes.
Okay.
So now it's probably much more difficult. So if you're attempting it, I think you're probably going to experience like not quite the dial being turned up like gradually, maybe the dial being, jacked up right really high at the start.
What do you like? I guess if you want to speculate, or what was like the attrition rate in your class, for instance? Is there like a normal kind of attrition rate you would expect?
For my class, it was I think about 75%. And it's tough to like nail it down because you start with a group from basic training, and then as you go, people quit or people fail out, or people wash out, and you get merged with other classes. So the people you kind of finish the pipeline with, at least the way it was for me, weren't really the people I started the pipeline with. I didn't have any setbacks or anything or any washbacks, so I was kind of like a straight shot through. And even then, I was getting merged with other teams along the way. But I do know that like from my basic training flight, there were like 18 of us that were going CCT with like contracts to at least attempt the pipeline. And there were 4 of us who made it through, including washbacks. So the other 14 did end up like either getting injured and getting knocked out or just, quitting. So yeah, like I think that's pretty common, like that 70-75%, at least it was when I went through. There's stories from like the 90s of like people going through Indoc and like graduating 2 people out of like more than 100. I don't know if that quite, happened that frequently, but those classes certainly happened back then. And nowadays, I think, on paper, the attrition rate actually might look a little lower because I think they do a better job of selecting people before they arrive to the orientation course or whatever they call it now. Because when I went through the pipeline, it did seem like a lot of people arrived without having a very good idea of kind of what they had gotten themselves into. It wasn't quite like they were, not in shape or not prepared. I mean, most of the people could, run, swim, do push-ups and pull-ups pretty decently, but I would say like the full scope of like what the pipeline wasn't totally clear to them, or maybe they hadn't just like mentally prepared fully, and people quit pretty early on. That like I kind of recall thinking like, you're in good shape, you seem like you're like a strong dude, so I don't really understand why like some of these guys quit on some of these events. But I think the gradual wear and tear of the pipeline, particularly the way it was designed when I went through it, it did kind of boil you pretty slowly, and it got very, very tiring. Selection wasn't too difficult, but then you move on, you go to like air traffic control school where you're doing the academic side of things, but you're also getting hammered by instructors in the evenings and in the mornings, like really early, and they're coming into your barracks at night, and on the weekends they're messing with you. And it didn't help that I was part of a pretty boisterous team, a team that got in trouble a lot on the weekends.
Yeah.
And so we were getting smoked maybe a little bit more than most people. But suffice to say, yeah, the pipeline, I think the attrition rate fluctuates, but it's usually probably about that like 70 to 80%.
I had a guy in my squadron. He went down. Is it what's it? Fort Benning, or I guess Fort Moore now. Is it the 21st Special Tactics Squadron? Or is that 24th?
So at Fort Benning, I think it's the 17th.
Okay,
Special
I'm way
Tactics
off.
Squadron.
I know
So.
like he didn't have to go through the pipelines. He ended up becoming a JTAC, but him talking about when you talk about like people are being better prepared, maybe that helps with the attrition rate. For those listening, like there's the Air Force physical fitness test, which is more or less a joke. It's push-ups, sit-ups, mile-and-a-half run or a shuttle run now, and there's like planks and different things. But the just the basic PT test for special operations, I mean, it's longer runs, swim. I think he had to do a swim, pull-ups, all kind of more of a way I guess traditionally think. So it's a complete departure, I guess, from the normal Big Blue Air Force, in my opinion.
Yeah, it definitely is. The when I went through, it was called the AFSOC PT test, and it was a 3 mile run, and I think that had to be done in under 21:30, which is like a 7:15, 7:10 mile pace for 3 miles. Not terribly difficult, I guess, but you also pair that with a mile swim. I don't remember the time with that, but that's basically in a 25-meter pool. That's like, oh gosh, it's quite a few laps.
Yeah.
It's very repetitive, and you don't have headphones. I mean, I don't think you even had headphones back during the run portion either. So, yeah, it gets very boring in there watching the pool lines at the bottom of the pool, and then on top of that, you had the push-ups, pull-ups, and sit-ups, and the numbers for some of those events actually, when you like look at them, aren't really that difficult. I think for the pull-ups, it was like 15 was the graduation requirement. And that's not that terribly difficult unless you have instructors who are like really sticklers for form, and they can really nail you on, like, you didn't go fully to the clavicle, or you didn't lock out at the bottom, you're going too a little too fast. I judge that as kipping, and so that one doesn't count. And so you kind of have the classic event where they have the counter and going through, and they're like, 1, 2, 2, 2, and you're like, gosh, none of those just counted. You just wasted a bunch of effort. And that gets a little easier as you go through the pipeline. I think there's less of an emphasis on, like, nailing people because their calisthenics are off. But early on, and especially at like air traffic control school, the PT tests are like huge gatekeepers. And I don't know if this is totally accurate, but at least going through the, like, the scuttlebutt on teams, or is that like the cadre there at air traffic control school are like beret guardians, and their goal is to use calisthenics to, if they don't get someone to quit, they'll maybe like knock them out by like not counting their calisthenics properly. I don't know if that like really ever happened all that much, but certainly, there is some subjectivity to like counting out calisthenics. And, you can have cadre who like count a little bit more difficult, and cadre who are a little bit more, not as judgmental if you're just like hitting numbers. But
Well, you mentioned air traffic control school. I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, but can you tell me like the role of a combat controller when you come out of the pipeline? What is your primary job?
yeah, it's kind of funny because the entire pipeline that I went through, you're gearing up for, and I think it's still designed this way, because the fundamental job of a combat controller is to be like in assault zone, like reconnaissance specialist. So you're focused on assault zones, whether that be like a drop zone or a landing zone, and you're basically fully trained to go into like an austere area and set that up. And that's also why there is like an emphasis on like halo jumping and diving, because these are all like methods to ingress to the objective. And so there's a huge emphasis on like getting to the objective, and then once you're there, being able to like covertly set up like an airfield or a drop zone. And that whole like assault zone reconnaissance mission is something that they were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq from time to time, and especially on the early side of the war, they did those missions. But it started to dwindle off because the wars kind of settled into place, and you didn't need to constantly scout out like new drop zones and whatnot, or new landing zones and airstrips. And so the focus, I'd say, pretty quickly shifted early on in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to the JTAC mission, which you mentioned. And that's just calling in airstrikes. I'm sure you guys talked a little bit about that on this, but I can detail that a little bit more later if you want. But the mission really quickly shifted to that. There was obviously a huge need for that. In like counterinsurgencies, one of the best benefit the counterinsurgent has is air power. And so if you can get, someone on a team that's roaming around in like the hinterlands of Afghanistan, or, even an urban area in Iraq, and you can get that person on the team to be always in communication with an aircraft, and also very well trained at talking that aircraft, which is moving very fast over the battlefield and doesn't have a good picture necessarily of what's going down all the time. If you can get that person to be able to talk that aircraft onto, whatever's firing at them, or just getting a general situational awareness of the battlefield, that, pays massive dividends for the ground team. And it, obviously did. I mean, you can look at like just the number of casualties throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons why it didn't like approach like Vietnam era levels, but I think a big part of it is probably because like our air support was really clutch throughout the war, and the massive one-sidedness of that like air support definitely helped us. And so the whole combat control career field really reoriented. They had always had JTACs and people who were trained to do that job, but that's not what you come out of the pipeline being like fully prepared to do. And so you have to actually go to an additional JTAC training course in order to get qualified to do that. So when I graduated the pipeline, I mean, it's 2 years, but you're really only qualified to do the assault zone reconnaissance type stuff. And so you have to get totally trained up for the JTAC thing. And that's like an additional, I think it fluctuates. For me, it was about a year just based on like how things were scheduled. But that's pretty common. So usually people aren't even deployable in the JTAC role for like 3 years after they enlist. Yeah, that's kind of the mission that dominated the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But nowadays, there's a lot of talk of going back to the fundamentals and going back to the assault zone reconnaissance type stuff, which is pretty cool. I was actually just reading another Sean Naylor book. Keep name dropping him, but this one's called Relentless Strike. And it's all about the history of Joint Special Operations Command. But in the early days in Afghanistan, there were Special Tactics Squadron members from the 2-4, which is the Tier 1 asset for Air Force Special Tactics. And the 2-4 had guys parachuting in, doing like actual halo jumps. And I guess they did like up to 10 of these, doing halo jumps into like southern Afghanistan, setting up landing zones, landing the C-130 that's adapted for JSOC missions on these little airstrips, dropping off an MH Little Bird, which is like the tiny little helicopter from Black Hawk Down the dudes are riding on the side of, dropping off the Little Birds in the middle of the night, and then having the Little Birds go and like attack objectives in like Taliban held territory. And this is all before, this is like very early days. I think this is like maybe late September, early October of the war in Afghanistan. So this is even before like, the horse soldiers and the Green Beret teams had come through and, they had combat controllers as well attached to them. But this was the early days, the like full up assault zone kind of recce mission. And, reading those stories, it's pretty cool. Just the amount of halo jumps they were getting in and, the actual mission they were pulling off, which was kind of like, kind of clever.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think, the Air Force, it struggles with, hey, like letting people know we play in the special operations world. But just as you mentioned, John Chapman receiving the Medal of Honor, obviously it took a while for him to get to it, but he was embedded with a SEAL team, and that having Air Force Bubba's embedded with special operation in the special operation community doing things like this is not an uncommon thing. I think to close the door on the combat control piece, one, looking at the Pacific and pivoting to near peer threat, they're reopening all these airfields. Like obviously there's probably a role for combat controllers operating in austere environments and on the fly. But I would imagine, hit 3-year anniversary of leaving Afghanistan, the chaos that was going on in the field, that's kind of a traditional role for a combat controller to control that field as we exited. I would imagine. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know specifically what guys were deployed and what their exact missions were, but I do know that there were CCTs that were deployed during the exit of Afghanistan at Kabul Airfield or Bagram Air Base, they were probably working. If I were to bet, they were probably helping with some of the air traffic. One of the less sexy but still kind of fundamental things you do as a combat controller is get deployed to like a disaster zone or a place like Bagram Air Base during an evacuation, and you can set up maybe not quite a control tower if there's no tower available, but you can just set up with picnic tables and radios, and you can just control air traffic. I don't think any combat controller would like say they're as good as an air traffic controller as like the people working at like major international airports, but they get pretty adept. And they also did that same mission during like the Haiti earthquake response, I think in like 2010 perhaps, but they sent like a team of controllers down there, and they were just working on a really austere airfield. One, I think opening it up and making sure like a plane could actually land there, which is a whole part of the assault zone recce mission, just checking out the airfield, making sure there's not like craters in it or like massive debris that you can't move. And if you can move it, using like demo to demolition to actually destroy it, which is something you also get trained for, like bringing demolition and blowing stuff off runways. So they were probably doing that in Afghanistan during the evacuation. And of course, there was also probably JSOC elements that had, CCTs attached to do the JTAC thing. There was probably white SOF, which is like not tier one, just like other SOF that were also there, like Green Beret ODAs that also had probably combat controllers attached to them. So I'd be willing to bet they were kind of like all littered throughout there. But the nature of it, just kind of like the Battle of Kasham, which we'll probably talk about, is that the units that actually get named that are a part of like a lot of these missions are like a SEAL team did this mission, or a Green Beret team did this mission, or there was a Ranger Recce company that did this mission. And oftentimes they do have like a combat controller PJs embedded with them who are just a member of the team. So that doesn't always make the headlines unless something goes really badly, like John Chapman, or something goes really well and they receive an award.
Yeah, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. You mentioned JTAC, so obviously that's a bolt-on, if you will, after you go through CCT and you're getting your training. I kind of equate it probably much like being a fighter pilot. You go through the B course, come out 9 months later knowing how to fly the jet, but you don't know how to employ it, so you're doing all sorts of top-off training, et cetera. But having that JTAC qualification, Joint Terminal Attack Controller, integral piece to close air support. And as you, again, alluded to with Afghanistan, Iraq, a lot of close air support missions going on for the last 20 plus years in that region. Can you talk to me about the JTAC pipeline? What was it like for you? How long did it take, et cetera?
Yeah, it was about 9 months to a year. I think if you want to go as fast as possible, maybe they could crunch it down to 6 months. But basically, the pipeline is really just one school you go to. It's so the Air Force has TACPs, whose job is to, as I understand it, just be JTACs. And they can be both conventional and special operations, whereas a combat controller or PJ, they graduate and they're immediately assigned to Air Force Special Operations Command. TACPs have to go through an additional selection course. And there's plenty of them at Special Tactics Squadrons. But the TACPs will go to a JTAC school that's either in Nellis Air Force Base in Vegas, or there's also one in Germany, maybe at Ramstein. I'm not really sure. But those are kind of the conventional JTAC schools. And then there's the Special Operations one, which is the one I went to, which is down in Yuma. And when you go there, you also go with there might be some people from other services there, like a SEAL or a Green Beret. They have trouble, at least the Green Berets, from what I understand, maintaining their JTAC qualification because they have so many other, usually they're like a Green Beret engineer sergeant or a Green Beret communication sergeant. And so when they're deployed, they have a whole other slew of responsibilities they have to focus on. So that's why throughout the war in Afghanistan, they leaned really heavily on grabbing combat controllers to do that JTAC mission for them. But this school itself is I think 3 or 4 weeks. It's not really long. And it's called SOTAC is the one I went to, the Special Operations Terminal Attack Controller course down in Yuma, Arizona, which is also where I went to Halo School. The Green Beret Halo School is down in Yuma as well. Not a lot going on in Yuma other than that. Very.
Yeah. I've been there once or twice. I could agree with that statement.
Yeah, not the most exciting place, but
great people.
The JTAC school was about 4 weeks, and then after that, in the school itself, I'm I'm even straining to remember if we did even live fire during that. I don't know. I think we had it planned in the 4th week, but I think that stuff got canceled. And so we just went out to the range and we had some aircraft doing dry runs and stuff. But most of that course is a lot of tests, a lot of map readings, a lot of map and compass type stuff, a lot of working with the Dagger GPS system that you have, a handheld GPS, and inputting coordinates and vectoring things, and just kind of getting used to the equipment, and also just making sure that you're competent enough to tell aircraft where to go, and also make sure where friendlies are all the time. It wasn't a really difficult course. I don't think people fail out of it that frequently. We had one person who failed out of it, and he was a Marine gunny sergeant, and I think he was with a Marine recon unit, but he was pretty old, and I think it was just kind of a old dog new tricks type thing. It was just a 40-year-old guy they're like trying to like teach to be a JTAC randomly. But other than that, it wasn't a super difficult course. But after that, when you graduate, you go back to your unit, and the way it worked for me is it was just like nonstop TDYs to temporary duty assignments to call in airstrikes. So we would go to like ranges all across, primarily the East Coast of the United States, because I was stationed at Pope Army Airfield, which is the 21st Special Tactics Squadron, Fort Bragg area in North Carolina. So we were going to ranges up near Atlantic City. There's a range up there. I think there was like an A-10 unit, guard unit that flies around there. So we were training with them, which is a fun place to go TDY. And then we were going down to Florida, kind of central Florida area, Savannah, Georgia area, North Carolina. There's a gun range out near the Outer Banks called the Dare Range. So we would just go to like all these different ranges and call in airstrikes and get a lot of different controls in and a lot of different cleared hots in. And you have to do, I don't remember all the requirements, but you have to do a certain amount of live drops with aircraft, and they have to meet certain conditions. I think they have to be like, some of them have to be at night, some of them have to be with different types of munitions, some of them, they have to meet different like requirements about like how the battlefield is set up during the scenarios. So there's all kinds of different like checklists that anyone in the military is familiar with. You have to like meet all these different requirements. And then at the end of it, you do like a final, like full training mission. And the instructors during like all those training missions, and especially the final one, they kind of like throw a lot of different crazy scenarios at you. Everything from like, you have to do a suppression of enemy air defenses before you're able to come in and bring, the aircraft in to do like the actual airstrike to support your team. Or some of the events are actually kind of fun. Like we, at one point we went to like downtown Savannah, Georgia, and we were in low visibility vehicles, really just rental vehicles. And we had like our actual kit on, but we were in civilian clothes, and we were just in the vehicles driving around, and we had the aircraft following us overhead. And, we were basically just working with him as if the city was an actual training ground. And afterwards we went out to bars and stuff. So that made it more fun. But
yeah, right.
There's all kinds of other stuff that goes into like the JTAC mission other than just like calling an airstrike. Sometimes you're asking aircraft to do like route scans ahead of you. Sometimes you're on foot and you need them to like, actually like tell you what is around corners and like what ways you can go, what the terrain looks like. Sometimes they're calling out, places on the roadway where, this looks like this is disturbed. There might be like an IED that was implanted. So the JTAC mission is just like all times maintaining like full contact with the aircraft and like informing your ground force commander, your Green Beret captain of like what they're seeing. And, that goes beyond just like being able to call in an airstrike. I mean, there's huge benefits to that. Massive amounts of situational awareness that's like transferred to the Green Beret captain, and he can then like make decisions based on that. So that's basically kind of an overview of what that whole training program was like.
Yeah, when you say not too difficult, I mean, again, for those like listening, JTAC, always knowing where the friendlies are, numero uno, but translating what you're seeing there at, ground level to what a pilot's seeing in the air, not always like the easiest thing to do. So hats off. I did notice how you just skipped over Shaw. You guys never hung out at Shaw and the Gamecock Moas. I don't know why you skipped that one and went to Savannah.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
I didn't control the budgets and the training programs. I was a little senior airman, so got out as an E4 Mafia member, so I didn't have to do the actual trip planning.
Talk to me a little bit about, so 2010 to 2015, and then you do, it looks like Afghanistan, right? A deployment there, and then doing some of the targeting and the strike cell for OIR in the initial days, which I'm curious, maybe we talked on the radio at some point or had some interaction with the opening days of OIR. But talk to me about the Afghanistan deployment first.
Yeah. So I think it started in like April 2014 is when I deployed to Afghanistan. I was attached to a Green Beret team out there, really just doing the typical JTAC mission. I went to southeastern Afghanistan, a province called Paktika, and it was an interesting deployment for reasons that honestly go beyond like the JTAC job. Like the unit I was attached to, the Green Beret unit, we were partnered with a Afghan militia unit called the VRU, which stood for Village Response Unit. And that was led by a guy named Azizullah Karwan, who was kind of like at least in this part of Afghanistan, kind of a very notorious figure. He was an ethnic Tajik, so like to other Tajiks, he was kind of like a national hero. To a lot of Pashtun, he was, a opponent, kind of a tyrant. But suffice to say, his unit, when we worked with them, were like very competent. I mean, there's anyone who deploys to Afghanistan or has spoken to people who've deployed to Afghanistan probably are aware of like green on blue incidents where Afghan forces will sometimes, for a whole slew of reasons, including being possibly co-opted and paid by the Taliban, or being threatened, or the families threatened by the Taliban, or maybe just having like a beef with Americans, they will turn their guns on their American trainers and kill them. And that happened pretty frequently in Afghanistan. And there's quite a lot of deaths that happened in that manner. But when I went to my unit, actually, one of the funniest things, or one of the most interesting things to me, was when I arrived, the Green Berets, I was talking to them about kind of like security situation and like what I needed, just getting kind of like an initial familiarization. And they're like, oh, you don't, and I asked them about, insider attacks, and like, oh, you don't have to really worry about that with our partner force. They are not, they have never done anything like that. And they're like extremely tactically competent. They, extremely loyal to us, all that stuff. And, throughout my deployment, like that definitely shined through. I mean, they were a really interesting group of people who ultimately like were really good at like running missions, and you felt really safe around them when you were on patrol. And they were also really generous. I mean, they would like take us to, we had our little base that we were assigned to in a place called Sharana, which is kind of the district, I think the provincial capital. It's a very, very small capital.
Loose terms.
But it's not quite like a state capital in the U.S. But we would have our little base there where our Green Beret team was assigned. But we would go out on patrols, and we would do like remain overnight missions out there, and oftentimes sleeping at like smaller bases that the Afghan partner force had. And they would like slaughter goats for us, and like feed us like meals that they would cook, and bring us chai tea and stuff. And we would just, have nice fires with them, and kind of good bonding experiences, I guess. That said, my experience with them was like basically wholly positive. And there were a lot of people prior to that who had like complained about this partner force, and accused his partner force of a lot of misgivings, because the commander of it was like, again, he was Tajik. There was the primary ethnic population in the area was Pashtun, and that created a lot of animosity. And the way this militia worked is, as far as I understand, it wasn't actually part of like the Afghan national defense infrastructure. It was wholly separate. Like the U.S. paid for this group off the books, and it had originally, again, this is like my understanding of it, it had originally been started as a like CIA paid security force around a listening post into Pakistan. And over time, I think that listening post got shut down, or like was just not very useful. And so this partner force got kind of like handled around, and they were like, hey, this is competent, so like these are good guys, so you can keep using them for other things. And I think they gave them basically over to Army Special Forces when the Special Forces started doing the village stability operations, where they go out to very rural parts of Afghanistan, work with like a local militia, and try to like put security at the local level on local level Afghans. And so this partner force kind of got folded into that effort and used for it. And, it's kind of a classic example of a partner force that is really good at the tactical stuff, but I don't think was ultimately that good at like winning the hearts and minds of the local population. There was a lot of accusations that they were just like rough with local forces or local peoples when they went into villages. I think a lot of this stuff happened when Americans weren't around, because I certainly never saw anything of that nature. But ultimately, this history of Afghanistan at large, but also this province, is that after we left, this force continued to exist. They tried to fold it into the Afghan police units that exist, like the myriad number of them, and they tried to make them like an Afghan police unit. And the province ended up getting taken over anyway. And maybe that's an indication that they didn't generate a lot of public support. And then also ultimately, Azizullah Karwan, the commander of our unit, of our partner force unit, he was actually assassinated in Kabul in 2018 while like picnicking with his family. So that kind of closed the chapter on Azizullah Karwan and like the VRU. And when he died, I remember I was like reaching out to like some of the other guys that like we had served with, because we interacted a lot with Azizullah Karwan. There were a lot of like assassination attempts on his life, including like one while we had been in theater. I was looking up some of the like past reporting stuff I hadn't even been aware of. It was from like before we had arrived in theater. A lot of it was like from 2010, and some of the stuff like had some really like nasty allegations against the guy, including like extortion, desecration of mosques, torture, things like that he had supposedly participated in. And a lot of this stuff was like put into like UN reports, and the US said they were investigating it, and not really much came of it. But I remember asking like one of the Green Beret guys years after the fact, after Azizullah Karwan was ultimately killed, and I asked him like what he thought of that, because like it seemed like some pretty nasty allegations. And he's like, yeah, in Afghanistan, anyone who's worth working with isn't necessarily going to be a good guy. And I kind of understand that mentality, but I also feel like that's a recipe for disaster in the long run. And I think, again, Afghanistan kind of showed that, the Taliban did move into a lot of villages and a lot of areas without firing a shot. And I think that was because they had public perception on their side. And I think part of the way they got that was because a lot of the partners that we picked in Afghanistan were characters who were, ultimately warlords, and they didn't generate a lot of public sympathy. So anyway, that's a long diatribe, but that's kind of like the non-JTAC side of my Afghanistan deployment, and kind of some of my takeaways from it. But
no, it's interesting you bring that up. I mean, I think if we look back on history, especially in the United States, we might have a track record occasionally siding with the wrong person, or just picking the person we think is going to do whatever we want, right? But they have a lot of history, then a lot of things that probably aren't like just a beacon of the shining example you want a person to be of society. It creates a lot of problems. I mean, Afghanistan, just talk about the variables and the dynamics, the social, economic, situation, the cultural differences. Like it's a melting pot. There's a lot going on, and just trying to go in there and, plop down one form of governance and say, hey, this is going to work. Might have been a little naive. Hindsight, looking back, I don't know, but yeah, not what we want. Can you talk to me a little bit about the strike cell with Baghdad? Because that's getting towards the end of your time is in the Air Force, but what was your role there? What was that like?
Yeah, so after we concluded our Afghanistan deployment, we were basically wrapping up my base. This was at a period where, like in 2014, we were supposed to be like withdrawing from the country, kind of, or like at least like withdrawing our posture, I think, back basically to like a few like nucleuses, mainly like, Kandahar Airfield and Bagram Airfield. And so we were shutting down our base in Afghanistan. This was like September timeframe, and the summer fighting season had ended. We retrograded our base, meaning like we actually, like, no kidding, like tore up. We were probably like 50 Americans in total at the base. It was basically just the Green Beret team and the people who were there to support them, including myself. And so we like literally like were like burning stuff, like burning like computer hardware, like basically burn pits, but burning a lot of like metal wires, and I guess that's mostly what burn pits are. That's why there's such a big problem with them.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was kind of funny. We were just demolishing the place, and then we turned over the keys to the Afghan forces and let them have the base after we left. We drove out of Afghanistan, or we drove out of that province and drove up to Shank Air Base, which is a much much bigger forward operating base. And from there, I was basically supposed to be going home, but I ended up getting routed to Iraq. Basically, as a lot of people are probably aware of, remember, ISIS was sweeping through northern Iraq and also parts of Syria, and basically expanding at like a exponential rate, or at least the way it looked at the time was pretty exponential. And I, along with a few other JTACs who were free, were basically routed into first Kuwait and then Baghdad in order to help stop that advance, basically. And this wasn't the type of close air support we were doing in Afghanistan, which is like, no kidding, like you're on patrol, you see, something off in the distance, you're like, talking to aircraft, trying to talk them onto it. You're, able to shoot smoke or use a laser to like identify targets. This was instead in Iraq, we were like in like a targeting cell, which felt like it's something out of like, in Jason Bourne movies where they go to like the CIA officers and they have like all the flat screens around them. That's kind of the environment it was. It was really high tech, and we just had constant feeds of all the aircraft flying around. And the goal was basically just to stop ISIS's advance. And we were providing close air support from the strike cell because U.S. forces weren't allowed to go forward. And we had, Iraqi military officers who they weren't JTACs, but they were like more trained in close air support. The Iraqi military being a lot more in general, more educated and more kind of traditionally manned than like the Afghan military. So it was much easier to like sit back in a strike cell and rely on them to feed you targeting information and provide kind of actual eyes on objectives or eyes on targets, while you just provided like clearance authority from Baghdad. And so that was what we were doing in Baghdad. And you were probably flying up there at that time. And there was a lot of news stories about like ISIS being, I think you can find these still, of like ISIS being like 14 miles from Baghdad. I don't know where that like line was actually drawn, but they were pretty far, but they were, I guess, pretty close. It really concerned a lot of people. They were certainly close to like Baghdad city limits. And, it's probably an open question, but I think there's still some debate over whether like ISIS could have actually taken Baghdad. I think that by that point, the Iraqi military had like maybe like strategically retreated and like consolidated their position. And I think they were in a better position to like actually defend Baghdad rather than retreat like they did in like Mosul or what have you. So I think Baghdad wasn't like ultimately super in jeopardy, but that was the starting point of consolidating Iraqi forces and then like rallying them to like push back and like retake the areas that ISIS had taken in the north. And that's what we were doing. And like it was a really obviously really target rich time. I mean, compared to Afghanistan, where you're dealing with like Afghan or Taliban fighters, and in my area of Afghanistan, we were actually dealing with a lot of Haqqani network fighters, but they would like operate in like 2s and 3s, and they had IED caches hidden in houses, and you'd like have them on like motorbikes taking pot shots at you or something. Like this was like, no kidding, like Afghan or ISIS forces rolling around in convoys with like ISIS flags flying. I mean, it was bizarre, and it was something they were doing because before the U.S. like actually started greenlighting airstrikes, there hadn't really been any, air support, at least at like a fast enough clip that they felt like they needed to go to like more dispersed tactics. And so early days of this, like ISIS was rolling around as like a conventional military, as if they did have their own air support and air defenses. And so it was a very target rich kind of area. And pretty wild just looking back on it, seeing some of that stuff. And you probably saw it too, like from your feeds and like from your sensor pods of just like, like ISIS forces riding around in like Toyota trucks, sure, but also like gun trucks that we had given the Iraqi military that had been abandoned, and like moving in like mass formations and like massing in like, stadiums and like, parking all their vehicles next to each other and holding rallies and stuff. And it was just, it was pretty wild. But I think that changed pretty quickly. But yeah.
Yeah. I think, some of our early days, you'd have like 20 or 30 guys in one building, or they'd have all their Humvees parked outside, right? Like just rolling up as if no one else is here, but that that turned once they figured out like, oh, if we gather in a group, we will all perish together, you know? So
Yeah.
there's funny, like right when I showed up, we were replacing the Masawa guys, and they had been doing Baghdad embassy defense just before things really went kinetic. And so they're just flying Overwatch, these long sorties, but then it went kinetic and really kicked off in like Kobani. And we were watching some of their tapes, but the guys, they're doing air raid drills. Like they're marching down the street, and it must be like 50 or 60 fighters. So you see them marching down the street and they scatter. Then they all come back together. They march down the street, they scatter, come back together. Well, like on the third iteration of that, that's when like 4, GBU 12s just smack into the street and just, they're all gone. So like, well, learn the hard way. Don't be ISIS. So that wrapped up your active duty time though, right?
Yeah. So I was only even in that strike cell, I was only there for like 2 months. And some of that time was even spent in Kuwait waiting to go in, because there was like this whole controversy about like boot count, and like obviously we had just left Iraq, and so now we were going back into Iraq, and even though the troops weren't like meant for combat, Baghdad was threatened, so there was all these like political considerations. But so it was 2 months there in Iraq, and then I came back and basically like started the process of like out processing the military, and I got out in like February 2015, so like early on in 2015, I ended up getting out of there. Made my way into the civilian world. I was free.
Yeah, obviously, I would say a slight departure from the special operations world, journalism. Had you always had that bug? What was that transition like?
Yeah, no, it was definitely not something I planned for. Initially, I'd always been interested in like public policy and government and things like that. Or maybe not always interested, but I had developed an interest throughout my time in the military. And so my initial goal was actually just to go to the DC area and go to school, and kind of start looking at what kind of options existed. I did a lot of internships. I interned for initially, I think my first one was for a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Judiciary Committee. And, I basically picked him just because he had a position open in his office. And he wasn't, totally batshit. So I, went to his office, and he was a nice guy. And I worked in his office, just doing very typical intern type stuff, which isn't that exciting, but being in the Senate was kind of interesting, and experiencing that whole environment. And it was kind of there that I actually started running into reporters a lot. And I started to, entertain the idea of journalism, because what I found when I was in the Senate was like, I'm not like a huge true believer I found it kind of difficult to like hitch my wagon to like any politician and like kind of be one of these people who has to like, rise and fall based on the success of a politician, or to, have to even just like, hitch your wagon to like a political party at large, and like have to, justify your existence based on like party dogma. And I kind of liked the journalists who I saw running around in Congress, pestering the lawmakers and their staff members. And when I basically finished that internship, I applied to work at my student newspaper, and got on. It wasn't that difficult, and they were really hurting for people. And so I worked there and kind of just started like refining my skills. And initially, I wasn't totally set on even going into journalism there. I was kind of just looking at it as like, testing the waters, also developing my writing skills a little bit more, which I felt like would be beneficial regardless of what I did. And from there, I actually got an offer to do like an internship at NBC Washington, which is just a TV station in Washington. It's the NBC affiliate for the DC area, and so it was a lot of local news. It wasn't like the most exciting stuff, and that taught me that I did like the fundamentals of journalism, but I didn't like the TV side of it. I wanted to stay on the print side of it, and so and even more specifically, I wanted to do like maybe more serious kind of reporting. And so while I was still an undergrad student, I applied for my student news, or not my student newspaper. I applied for Military Times, which is like this independent group of newspapers. If anyone has been to like a PX and seen like Air Force Times or Army Times or Marine Corps Times on the stands, it's those all fall under this company. And or at least it did. It's kind of a shadow of its former self now. But the all those papers belong to the Military Times group of publications, and it's like different from Stars and Stripes, which is like funded by the DoD, and like the DoD doesn't have any editorial control over Stars and Stripes, but the DoD does, fund it. It is kind of like if you work for Stars and Stripes, I think you're actually like a government employee. So Military Times is different in that it's totally a private organization, and it has maybe not the best reputation all the time with every service member, but I enjoyed working there. I felt like we did a lot of really good journalism, and we spotlighted a lot of like really important issues. And it was a good place to work and kind of like bust my chops and cut my teeth and like learn a lot about journalism business and newspapering. And it was it was considered what is like the format of it was basically a tabloid, and which is not to be confused with like a tabloid based on like the content, kind of like the colloquial way of saying tabloid. It's more of just like the format of how it was designed. But that was a really good experience learning how that's produced. And like I ended up about 4 years into my time there, I ended up becoming an editor and learned a lot more about that side of the operations. And I ended up leaving in 2022. So just a couple of years ago, and I, left. And over the past 2 years since I left, they went through a lot of like downsizing and stuff. So they got slashed really hard, but it's still a good place to work. And, I enjoyed the projects we worked on there.
Yeah. But now, so at the Washington Post, right?
Yeah.
Predominantly.
Yeah. So yeah, I ended up getting hired in 2022 to be an editor on the general assignment desk, which is the Washington Post's like jack of all trades desk. Kind of like my wife works in emergency medicine, so I always say it's kind of like triage in the newspaper world. Like we basically, anytime there's like a mass shooting or an assassination attempt on the former president, or anything, that pops up randomly and is like gaining a lot of traction. We are kind of like the triage team that usually goes after the news, sets up stuff, and either we'll continue reporting it if like it doesn't fall in the purview of any other desk, or if they just need help covering it. So for instance, the Titan submersible explosion, if people remember that, there was these 4 individuals who took a submersible ride down to view the Titanic. It imploded, but before we realized it had imploded, there was like a Coast Guard search for about a week, and that gained a lot of news traction. And the search itself, and also just the uncovering of the kind of shoddy maybe craftsmanship of the device itself they were riding on, and also the lack of like regulations that allowed this device to exist and legally launch in the middle of the ocean without anyone actually inspecting it. So there was a lot of stuff that was coming out at the time, and it was kind of a big news story, and there was no other desk at the Post that like owned that story, and so it fell to general assignment. And I was basically on that entire week, so I was leading a lot of the coverage of it. And that's kind of a very typical example of like a story that if we get it, we own it, and we have a lot of fun reporting it and covering it and reporting like the accountability angle and all that. And other times, it's just kind of a slog getting through other less exciting news events, but it's a good job.
Well, so your name popped up because I saw the Air Force Cross being awarded, I think, to the 24th Tactical Squadron Airmen for the Battle of Kasham back in 2018. And that was your article. I think I saw it carried on Military Times. I know there's probably some syndication that I don't know anything about, but can you talk to me a little bit about that article that you wrote there and broke? And then I would probably start really with like what that battle was, the significance, and for those who aren't too familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. So, people who aren't familiar, I guess I'll just start with the layout of like northeastern Syria at the time of these events in 2018. It also, basically how it stands today too. So there's a lot of different nations that have their fingers in the Syria pot. One being the United States, who backs the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a primarily Kurdish led militia in northeast Syria. We used them a lot to fight ISIS. And after ISIS was defeated in like the territorial sense, it lost its caliphate. We continue to remain in the country backing the SDF and helping them, like making sure ISIS doesn't rise again, but also there's probably a lot of geopolitical considerations for the reasons why we hang around in that region. And, one of the geopolitical considerations is Russia backs the Assad regime in the rest of Syria, and the Assad regime is very eager to get back maybe that northeast corner of the country because it's a very oil-rich area, and the Kurdish forces who we back use a lot of that oil for revenue generation purposes. It helps their region. And the other country that has a lot of stake in the Syria situation is Turkey, just to the north of Syria, which has historically had been battling insurgencies with Kurdish forces, and they are not very pleased that the U.S. is backing a Kurdish force in that part of Syria. And Turkey has at various times basically like invaded south into Syria and done limited operations to kind of clear different areas and hold them. And so that's just the backdrop of like the U.S. is in this corner of Syria. There are there's a NATO ally to the north who we're trying not to upset, but we also want to continue holding this portion of land, which also upsets the government of Assad, which wants to kind of like make whole its country again. And the government of Assad is backed by Russia. And then within that, you have like, you have Russian regular forces, and then you have Russian mercenary forces that kind of are organized into a whole bunch of different little mercenary bands, and kind of colloquially all referenced as like Wagner mercenaries, though as I understand it, like none of them are officially like called Wagner on paper. A lot of them are called different things, and they are usually associated with either what this umbrella organizations set up by Wagner Associates, or maybe even like independent and serve other purposes. But that's basically the layout of Syria. And so in 2018, ISIS wasn't yet totally defeated, and there was a deconfliction line that had been set up roughly along the lines of the Euphrates River, and that kind of cuts across Syria's like northeast corner. So the U.S. basically owned things to the east of that, and the Russians would work to the west of that. And that was to prevent all sorts of different problems where Russian and U.S. fighter pilots maybe bumping into each other, and it hasn't fully, I think, squashed those issues, but it was at least set up with the purpose of limiting the blowback if something went wrong there. And in addition to that, there was also like a deconfliction line set up, so like the U.S. could call and tell or call and ask, Russian officials like, hey, are these your guys? Or, hey, you're doing this, or, hey, we just want to check here. We're doing, just deconfliction, make sure like they don't run into each other. So on the night of like February 8th, 2018, there were a JSOC element. There was a JSOC element with about 30 people in total. That was a mix of like Delta Force guys, Rangers, I believe, and then also combat controllers from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, the Tier 1 combat control unit. So these 30 guys were at like a place called Kanoko Fields. It's basically like a gas station, or not a gas station, a like oil field area with probably a refinery. And so they were basically there with their Kurdish partner force doing some counter ISIS stuff. That hasn't fully come out like what exactly their mission was, but you can kind of guess it was probably to prevent ISIS from like regaining control of some of these oil fields, and also maybe doing a little bit of offensive planning against ISIS forces. But regardless, the JSOC element was at this oil field area, going late into the night, and they were planning on remaining overnight. But early in the afternoon, they had noticed, like around 3 p.m., they had noticed like a massing of forces on the other side of the river. And it was looking like it was like heavy artillery, like main battle tanks, T-72 battle tanks, and gun trucks in general. And so these forces are all like massing up. And there's an initial call that goes out from the U.S. side to the Russians and asks them, "Hey, are these your guys?" And the Russians deny it. And so the afternoon proceeds. The understanding on the U.S. side is that these aren't affiliated with Russia or Syria. And anyone who knows about the hodgepodge of the Syrian civil war knows there's an entire alphabet soup of different militias and tribal groups and, extremists and, moderate rebels and whatnot. So it could be anyone. So these guys are like massing there, but there's a lot of them and they have a lot of like conventional military equipment, the kind of stuff like you didn't really see in like the war in Afghanistan, like a main battle tank.
Yeah.
And so these guys are all massing. And then like around, I think maybe like 10 p.m., they start basically trying to ford the river, I think crossing it like a bridge. And some warning shots go out from the American side. And I don't know the exact distance. I think it was like probably like almost like a mile from like these two parties were like almost a mile from each other. But it was, clear they were coming over the deconfliction line. And the warning shots aren't heeded, and then that turns into actual shots being fired. And sometime in that mix, possibly before the warning shots, possibly like after, artillery starts getting fired. Heavy artillery is landing like within 500, a couple hundred meters of like U.S. positions. And the Delta Force guys basically ask another Green Beret team, which is at a mission support site, quite a bit of ways away, to start spinning up like a quick reaction force, get your gun trucks ready and come, back us up here. So those guys start moving out. Meanwhile, aircraft, anyone, when, there's not a lot of U.S. troops in a theater and then they start getting troops in contact, every aircraft is getting pushed to that area. And so my understanding is like the JTAC, who was embedded, the combat controller who was embedded with these Delta Force guys, was getting like F-22s, AC-130 gunships, B-52s, like drones, everything was getting pushed to him. And he started using it. And so this firefight starts happening. The Delta Force guys are like responding with their weaponry. I think mainly like what they were firing back with was like ATGMs, like guided missiles, anti-tank missiles, and 50 cal machine guns. It wasn't like at the range where like you could use a carbine, as far as I understand it. It was more of like a distance of like 1,500 to 2,000 meters. And so that's also the best distance for aircraft to be getting utilized as well. So they were utilizing the aircraft, trying to silence the artillery at the same time as like these vehicles are apparently moving towards the Americans. And the Green Beret team that was spun up as a QRF is trying to make their way, but the roads are just demolished. There's a lot of craters in them. There's down power lines. And so they have to roll in like blackout conditions as well because of, security concerns, in case like if they have a bunch of headlights coming up and they're a clear convoy moving, they're, a duck, a perfect target. So they're rolling in blackout conditions, like watching through thermal and night vision and, making their way over to the fight. And they get there right about the time, I guess, the artillery kind of gets silenced by the airstrikes that are happening. But the massive forces still appears to be moving. The battle tanks are moving and they're also shooting. And so like another volley of fighting kicks off. Some aircraft at that point are obviously out of Winchester, they're out of ammunition and they're heading home. Others, arriving on station. And the U.S. just kind of throws like, I think everything it had at this problem at the time, everything in theater at the time. And, it's tough to know like whether the massive forces were like so dead set on just taking this oil field, or if perhaps they they were, continuing to move for other reasons. But suffice to say, like, they even dismounted at one point and like continued to try to move up. And that's when, like, I think a lot more of the casualties actually started to happen from the airstrikes. And I've seen other reporting, like there's a good report by Der Spiegel, a German outlet, that says one of the reasons why they continued to move forward was because they were actually trying to collect their dead. They weren't trying to like continue to take the oil field. And so that kind of explains like the stubbornness, because this whole like incident went on for like 3 or 4 hours. I mean, they just kept like advancing. And so, ultimately, they repelled the attack. U.S. forces suffered like 1 wounded, and I think that was just one of the Kurdish partner forces. So, I don't know how you sustain an artillery barrage like that and not take any wounded, but they managed to do it. I guess they had really good defensive positions. At the end of it, one of the things, you had mentioned it, my reporting on it was, I figured out that they had awarded an Air Force Cross to the JTAC who had been involved in this. Don't know his name. He was a combat controller assigned to the Tier 1 unit, of course. And he basically received the Air Force Cross for like, the citation's pretty thin, but it sounds like it was effectively, stepping out in front of fire coming from artillery, main battle tanks, and continuing call in airstrikes throughout all that. And, the Air Force Cross, not a small award. I mean, that is second only to the Medal of Honor. I've covered in the past when I was at Military Times, Tier 1 units that received like Distinguished Service Crosses. And in the past, I've been told that sometimes like a service cross will get awarded because it's not really feasible to award a Medal of Honor, because that comes with a lot more high profile kind of events attached to it. And so sometimes, and you've seen this from like the Vietnam War, sometimes service crosses get upgraded decades later. So, I don't know if this is a situation where the actions like warrant a higher medal. I had some people asking me that, but suffice to say, you can read the citation. I think I posted it on my Twitter account, or I pinned it on my Twitter account. And it is pretty thin, but, just the idea that like someone was calling in airstrikes against like main battle tanks and stuff, that's not something like a lot of American citations have in the modern era. Maybe some Ukrainian ones at this point and some Russian ones against Ukrainians, right. But not something American forces have like routinely faced. So all in all, pretty shocking incident. I think if I could just go on a little bit longer, I'll just say like one of the controversies surrounding it is obviously anytime like nuclear powers clash, there's a lot of concerns about like, could this blow up? Pretty much immediately, the Russians distanced themselves from it. I think the deconfliction line continued to be used throughout the fight. And ultimately, like sometime in the middle of it, the Russians did say that they had some forces that were embedded with this mass. And one of the enduring questions is like, how many Russians were there? I mean, you had a lot of statements after the fact that seemed to indicate it was like hundreds of Russians had been killed, or at least imply that hundreds of Russians had been killed. I think it was probably just based on like further reporting that has been done and families that have like posted tributaries to, their family member who died in Syria, and like other investigative work that has been done by a lot of outlets. It seems like it was probably more like a dozen to 20 Russians were actually involved in this thing, which makes sense, if they're actually operating as like a unit that trains some militia forces. And, on top of that, another enduring question is like, to what extent was it something that the Russian government was aware of, that the Syrian government was aware of? I think there's plenty of opportunities in Syria for, just like in Afghanistan, local businessmen / warlords to pay people to do things for them. And again, this is a part of Syria that has very, very lucrative oil fields. And so getting those back in your control is imperative, So, there's a lot of speculation that can be done, but ultimately that was like the run of what we know based on like the open source reporting about the firefight and how it went down. Yeah.
Investigative journalism piece, that's like super interesting to me. I remember if we're talking Crimea, I think Vice News, it was kind of first exposing social media where, Russian was saying they didn't have anyone across the border and it wasn't any Russians doing it. but they followed one guy who kept posting on Twitter or Instagram, or some, Telegram, social media platform. And the Vice guy traced his, lineage all the way back to Eastern Russia and was taking pictures where he took pictures on social media. Like clearly he was Russian in there, but kind of goes to the point of like, obviously the government's probably, whatever government might be is, they're probably going to keep stuff close hold regardless of who they are. But the fact of like, you have family members who are mourning, posting things, like doing that type of digging in this day and age affords the opportunity, I guess, to give another light or another lens to try and figure out what actually happened.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that like, the Russian military can't really, I think, squash completely. Even in like the war in Ukraine, there's been, um, there have been conscripts killed from time to time, and like Russia, as far as I understand it, doesn't actually. It's against the policy to have conscripts actually fight in Ukraine. They're supposed to just be for training them up on the home front, and then hopefully getting them to sign like contracts to become contract soldiers. But when contract soldiers have been killed, that's something that their families have posted about, and the government can't really shut that down. And so, like, obviously Putin has a lot of control over the country, but it's not like a total control. And if anything, like he has to respond to those events, and kind of like when families have posted about like their family member dying, Putin, as far as I understand it, has like come out with statements saying like, we'll fix this shouldn't have happened, kind of thing. And so I think similarly, like, you have these like mercenary forces, people who sign up to go to like Syria or something like that. And the benefit, I think, from the Russian perspective is they are, there's a lot of plausible deniability. They're going on their own volition. They are not associated with us. The downside, of course, is also that like they have probably like, extensive family networks, and some of them are going to notice when those people go missing, and they're going to post about it. If these people aren't the Russian mercenaries who sign up for this, they're not like, Jason Bourne figures who have no, family members. They are people who, were once soldiers or were once members like the security services who continue to like work in like the private sector. And that creates some problems. But like, I guess like long term, I don't know if it really created a ton of issues for the Russian government. It did seem at the time like it was like a massive embarrassment or big deal. But, I think Russia has proven that it's like pretty willing to use some of these mercenaries in like expendable ways. And, they are pretty good at absorbing the blowback when it does happen.
Yeah. I mean, they did invade a country. So, at some point, like, you're only gonna do so much. So before we wrap up, one, I hope you hang around for a There I Was story, but where can people find you and get in contact with you if need be?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter as Kyle_Rempfer. That's probably the easiest way to reach me. You can DM me. My DMs should be open. And I also I can drop my email. I don't know if you have like a description or anything like that, but I can.
Yeah, I'll link those down below, and whatever else you send over, we can put those down in the show notes. So if you're looking for Kyle where he lives, that'll be down there in the description as well. So before we wrap up, any parting shots, anything that I should be asking you that I might have missed?
No, I think we covered it. Appreciate being brought on, and I appreciate having the chance to chit chat all off the cuff. So if I said anything that was wrong or factually inaccurate, I don't take any responsibility for it.
Yeah, well, I think you alibied it with suspected, or better than what I normally do and just make these wild allegations. So much better than me. Well, Kyle, I appreciate you joining me on the podcast, and look forward to talking to you here for There I Was here in a second.